This is Mr. Wesley, and one of the most consistent and most privately carried grievances among men over 50 who have been through the ending of a long marriage is this: the specific and sustained experience of being held accountable for the marriage's failure by someone who was never held accountable in return. Not in a vindictive sense, not with malice or deliberate unfairness necessarily behind it, but in the specific and structural sense that the cultural and therapeutic frameworks surrounding the marriage's difficulty, and then its ending, were organized around an accounting that consistently positioned his behavior as the primary variable requiring examination and change, while her behavior was consistently positioned as the understandable response to his failures, rather than as an independent variable with its own contribution to the dynamic. He was emotionally unavailable. She was responding to his emotional unavailability. He was not meeting her needs. She was expressing the frustration of unmet needs. He withdrew. She pursued. He failed to do the emotional labor. She was exhausted by doing it alone. Every frame the therapy offered, every framework the cultural conversation provided, every language available in the space where the marriage was being examined, ran through his behavior as the cause and hers as the effect. And the man inside that accounting, who knew from the inside that the picture being drawn was incomplete, had almost no available language for saying so that did not immediately get reframed as defensiveness, resistance to accountability, or further evidence of the emotional unavailability that was causing the problem in the first place. That dynamic is what today is about, not as a grievance exercise, as a clinical examination of why accountability distributes itself the way it does in long marriages that fail, what the psychological and cultural mechanisms are that produce the asymmetry, and what the honest and complete accounting of a marriage's failure actually requires of both parties if either of them is going to carry genuinely useful understanding forward. I am Mr. Wesley. This is Relational Insights. Let me give you the mechanism. The first thing you need to understand is what psychologists who study self-serving attribution bias call the actor-observer asymmetry in close relationships. This is a foundational concept in social psychology that describes a well-documented and consistent human tendency to explain our own behavior primarily through situational factors while explaining other people's behavior primarily through dispositional factors, through their character, their choices, their fundamental nature as a person. When I do something that produces a negative outcome, I am responding to the situation. When you do something that produces a negative outcome, it is because of who you are. In a long marriage that is in difficulty, this asymmetry runs in both directions simultaneously, but it runs differently for each partner because the cultural and therapeutic frameworks that surround the marriage's examination are not symmetrically organized. The frameworks available for understanding marital difficulty were built, as I described in the accountability epidemic video earlier in this series, primarily from clinical literature that used female experience as its primary data source. That literature consistently positioned female behavior in troubled marriages as situationally determined, as the understandable response to an environment shaped by male emotional unavailability, and male behavior as dispositionally determined as the expression of a character deficit that required examination and change. The result is a cultural framework for marital accountability that is structurally asymmetric before any specific couple walks into a therapist's office or has a specific difficult conversation about the state of their marriage. The framework already has a built-in direction. Male behavior is the primary object of accountability. Female behavior is the contextual background against which male behavior is assessed. And that built-in direction shapes every conversation about the marriage's difficulty in ways that neither party is typically conscious of, because both parties have absorbed the framework from the culture that surrounds them and are operating inside it as though it were simply the accurate description of reality rather than one particular and incomplete framing of a bidirectional dynamic. The second mechanism is the specific way that emotional labor asymmetry interacts with accountability asymmetry in long marriages. I have described the emotional labor dynamic across multiple earlier videos in this series, and I want to address it here from the accountability angle specifically because the interaction between the two is the source of one of the most common and most difficult experiences men in long marriages report: the experience of being held accountable for a deficit while the behavior that produced the deficit is exempt from equivalent examination. Here is the specific dynamic. In most long marriages that develop significant difficulty, the wife has been doing more of the relational maintenance work, more of the bid initiation, more of the repair attempts, more of the emotional tracking and attending that the relationship's health requires. That asymmetry is real, and it is significant, and it deserves to be taken seriously as a genuine contribution that generates genuine costs for the person carrying it. I have addressed it honestly and without minimizing across this series. What the accountability framework built around that asymmetry consistently fails to examine with equivalent honesty is the specific behavior that the emotional labor asymmetry produces in response to the deficit it is addressing. When a person carries a sustained and unacknowledged labor burden in a relationship, they develop behavioral responses to that burden that are entirely understandable in their motivation, and that are also, in many cases, significant contributors to the specific dynamic that makes the relationship difficult to be inside. The bid initiation that becomes demand, the emotional tracking that becomes monitoring, the repair attempt that becomes escalation when it is not received as intended, the accumulated resentment that produces the resentment archive I described in an earlier video, and that shapes every subsequent interaction through the filter of its unprocessed weight. These behaviors are not independent of the emotional labor asymmetry. They are produced by it, and they are sustained by it, an understanding that is important and legitimate. What the standard accountability framework consistently fails to do is hold those behaviors to the same standard of examination that it holds the emotional unavailability that preceded them. The emotional unavailability is a character deficit requiring change. The behaviors it produced are situationally determined responses requiring understanding. The asymmetry in how those two things are treated is not a neutral or inevitable feature of how marital accountability works. It is a specific and documentable bias in the frameworks through which marital difficulty is examined. And the man who has spent years being held accountable inside that biased framework, while the behaviors his wife brought to the same dynamic were consistently exempted from equivalent accountability, has a legitimate and specific grievance that the cultural conversation has consistently failed to acknowledge with any precision. The third mechanism is what I am calling the victimhood protective function. And I wanted to be careful with this one because it is the most easily misused of the three mechanisms I am describing today, and the one most likely to be received as an attack on women, rather than as the clinical description of a human psychological pattern that is not exclusive to women, and that serves a specific and understandable function in the person deploying it. The research on victimhood narratives in close relationships is consistent across gender lines in identifying a specific pattern in which the adoption of a victim position in a relationship conflict serves a protective function for the person adopting it. Specifically, the function of preempting accountability by establishing a prior and more serious harm. If I am the injured party in this dynamic, I cannot simultaneously be the accountable party. The victim position is not compatible with the accountable position, and the human psyche under relational stress has a well-documented preference for the former over the latter. This pattern operates in both directions in troubled marriages. Men use it, women use it. It is not a female-specific behavior. What makes it relevant to the specific experience of men over 50 in failing long marriages is the specific and asymmetric ease with which the victim position is available to each party. The cultural and therapeutic frameworks I described above provide the female partner in a troubled marriage with an extensively developed and broadly socially supported language for her experience of the marriage as harmful or inadequate. Language that positions her as the person to whom the marriage has been done, rather than as an active participant in the dynamic. The male partner in the same marriage has access to almost none of that language in equivalent form, for the reasons I have described at length across this series. The asymmetric availability of the victim position is not a product of who is actually more victimized in any specific marriage. It is a product of which party has access to the frameworks that make the victim position available and legitimized. Picture this. There is a man I know, I will call him Christopher, who spent 4 years in couples therapy with his wife in the final difficult stretch of a 30-year marriage. Christopher was, by his own account, a genuinely willing participant in the therapeutic process. He engaged with the frameworks offered. He acknowledged the specific ways his emotional unavailability had contributed to the dynamic. He did the specific work the therapy required and attempted to implement its insights in the marriage. He told me that across the 4 years of therapy, he could count on one hand the number of sessions in which his wife's behavior was the primary object of the therapeutic examination, rather than the contextual background against which his behavior was being assessed. He told me one specific session had stayed with him. He had described a pattern of his wife's behavior, the specific way that certain conversations escalated beyond what the original issue warranted, the way historical grievances were introduced into current conflicts in a manner that made it impossible to address the current issue without simultaneously addressing every previous unresolved incident, and had asked whether that pattern was something the therapy could address directly. The therapist, he said, had responded with an explanation of how that pattern was the understandable response to years of emotional unavailability, which was true, partially, and which was also the specific reframing that made his wife's behavior the effect, rather than the cause, and which therefore exempted it from the direct examination he was asking for. Christopher told me he had left that session with the specific and private understanding that the accounting the therapy was performing was not going to produce what he had been hoping it would produce, which was a complete and honest examination of both parties' contributions to the dynamic. It was going to produce a refined and increasingly sophisticated version of an accounting that had already decided where the primary responsibility lay before the examination began. Christopher is not describing a therapist who was malicious or incompetent. He is describing a therapist who was operating inside the same cultural and clinical framework that most therapists in this space operate inside, a framework with a built-in directional bias that neither the therapist nor the couple was likely to be conscious of as a bias, rather than as simply the accurate description of how troubled marriages work. I want to stay here with you for a moment before I give you the framework for what genuine mutual accountability actually looks like, because the weight of what I have been describing is landing with a specific kind of recognition for many of the men listening to this, and I want to address that recognition directly rather than moving past it. If you spent years inside a marriage in which you were genuinely engaging with an accountability process that was not being applied to both parties with equivalent seriousness, and if you carried the full weight of that asymmetric accounting without ever having the language to name what was asymmetric about it, the recognition of what I am describing today carries a specific and important relief alongside everything else it carries. The relief of a man who was not imagining it, who was not being defensive or resistant or refusing to take responsibility, who was, accurately, experiencing an accounting process that was incomplete in a way that the frameworks available to him at the time gave him no adequate language to name. That recognition matters, not because it removes your genuine contribution to the marriage's difficulty. Your contributions were real, and I have addressed them honestly across this series, but because it allows you to separate your genuine contribution from the inflated and asymmetric accounting that attached itself to that contribution and made it the entire story. Your genuine contribution and the entire story are not the same thing. They were never the same thing. And the man who can distinguish between the two is the man who carries forward the right amount, the amount that is honest and accurate and genuinely useful for the next chapter, rather than the amount the asymmetric accounting assigned him. Here's what genuine mutual accountability actually looks like in a marriage. And I want to give you this as a description of what was missing, rather than as a prescription for what you should now do. Because in most cases, the marriage this video is describing is already over, and the most useful application of this framework is forward-looking, rather than retrospective. Genuine mutual accountability requires that both parties' behavior in the dynamic be held to the same standard of examination, not the same conclusions, because the specific contributions of each party are specific to each party and may well be genuinely different in their nature and their magnitude, but the same standard of honest and direct examination, rather than the asymmetric application of accountability to one party and contextual explanation to the other. It requires the specific and clinical recognition that bidirectional dynamics have two engines, not one. That the demand-withdrawal cycle I have described across this series runs because both the demand and the withdrawal are continuously regenerating each other, and that an accounting of the cycle that examines one engine while treating the other as the environment is not an accounting of the cycle at all, but an accounting of one component of it. It requires the willingness of both parties to hold their own behavioral contributions to the dynamic to the same honest scrutiny they are applying to the other party's contributions, a willingness that is, in practice, significantly more demanding than it sounds, because the actor-observer asymmetry and the victimhood protective function and the availability of culturally supported exemptions all work continuously against that willingness in both directions. And it requires, perhaps most importantly, the specific and honest acknowledgement that the frameworks through which the marriage's difficulty has been examined may themselves have been biased in ways that neither party was fully conscious of, that the accounting both parties have been carrying may be a product not only of what actually happened, but of the specific and incomplete frameworks through which what happened was interpreted. That acknowledgement is not comfortable. It requires a level of intellectual honesty about the reliability of the tools through which both parties understood their own experience that most people do not naturally extend to frameworks they absorbed from the culture around them, rather than consciously chose. But it is the acknowledgement that makes a genuinely complete accounting possible. And a genuinely complete accounting, carried forward with honesty and without the distortions of the asymmetric framework, is the most valuable thing either party can take from a marriage that failed. Because it is the thing that makes the next chapter different from the one that ended, rather than simply a relocated version of the same dynamic. The accountability crisis in long marriages is not a female problem or a male problem. It is a framework problem. The frameworks through which marital difficulty and marital failure are examined are incomplete in specific and documentable ways that produce systematic asymmetries in how accountability is distributed. Understanding those asymmetries precisely is not the same as rejecting accountability. It is the same as insisting that accountability be accurate, applied to both parties, to both engines of the bidirectional dynamic, with the same honesty and the same directness that produces information you can actually build from, rather than an asymmetric accounting that leaves one party carrying more than was ever honestly theirs. Drop a comment. Men, was there a specific moment in your marriage or in the therapy you did during the marriage when the asymmetry in how accountability was being applied became impossible to ignore, and how did you respond to that recognition at the time? Subscribe to Relational Insights. Every week, Mr. Wesley breaks down the real dynamics inside long marriages and their endings, with the clinical precision and the genuine honesty that finally gives men the complete accounting they were never offered during the process itself.